For decades, dual booting was the unspoken contract between two worlds that never truly trusted each other. On one side, you had Windows, polished, commercial, familiar, the operating system that dominated offices, gaming rigs, schools, and homes. On the other side, you had Linux, powerful, open, endlessly customizable, respected by developers and sysadmins, but often misunderstood by everyday users. Dual booting existed because people wanted the best of both worlds, but had to keep them physically separated, like two rival countries sharing a border but refusing to open it. You'd restart your machine, pick a side, and live in that ecosystem until the next reboot. That ritual defined an entire generation of power users, but something strange has been happening quietly, almost invisibly, over the last few years. That border is dissolving, the walls are thinning, and for the first time, it's fair to ask whether dual booting as we know it is slowly becoming obsolete. The idea that Windows and Linux could merge into something resembling a single workflow would have sounded ridiculous not long ago. Historically, these systems weren't just different in design, they were different in philosophy. Windows was closed, Linux was open. Windows chased mass adoption. Linux chased freedom and control. The communities didn't just disagree, they often mocked each other. Yet today, many Windows users are running Linux every day without even realizing it. And many Linux users rely on Windows technology without ever booting into Windows itself. The lines have blurred so much that the old mental model of choose one OS no longer matches reality. One of the biggest cracks in the dual boot wall came from an unexpected place: Microsoft itself. When Microsoft introduced the Windows Subsystem for Linux, it wasn't just a technical feature, it was a philosophical shift. Suddenly, Linux wasn't an enemy to be replaced, it was a tool to be embraced. Developers could open a Windows laptop, type a command, and drop straight into a real Linux environment running native binaries. No virtual machine window, no reboot, no second partition, just Linux, living inside Windows like it had always belonged there. At first, many Linux users dismissed WSL as a toy or a compromise, but Microsoft kept iterating. WSL2 brought a real Linux kernel. Performance improved, GUI Linux apps gained official support. GPU acceleration arrived. And slowly, the joke stopped being funny because it started being useful. At the same time, Linux wasn't standing still either. Desktop Linux matured in ways that went largely unnoticed outside the community. Hardware support improved dramatically. Gaming, once Windows' strongest weapon, started shifting thanks to Proton and Steam. Applications that once forced people to reboot into Windows simply to get work done began to appear natively on Linux or run flawlessly through compatibility layers. Even Microsoft's own tools like Visual Studio Code, Edge, and Teams found comfortable homes on Linux desktops. The irony was impossible to ignore. Microsoft software running better on Linux than some native Linux alternatives ever did. What this created was a strange new reality. A Windows user could do Linux work without leaving Windows, and a Linux user could do Windows work without leaving Linux. The traditional reason for dual booting, which was I need both operating systems for different tasks, began to lose its strength. If you're a developer, you might code against Linux servers using WSL on Windows. If you're a gamer, you might run Windows-only games on Linux through Proton. If you're a content creator, your tools might already be cross-platform. The reboot became friction. And in modern computing, friction is the enemy. Virtualization also played a huge role in this shift. Virtual machines used to be heavy, slow, and awkward. Running Linux inside Windows felt like a compromise. Today, virtualization is so efficient that many users forget they're even using it. With hardware acceleration, shared file systems, and seamless window integration, a Linux VM can feel almost native. On Linux, tools like KVM and GNOME boxes make running Windows surprisingly smooth. On Windows, Hyper-V and WSL make Linux feel like just another terminal tab. The psychological barrier is gone. You're no longer switching operating systems. You're just opening an environment. But the real story goes deeper than tools and performance. What's happening now is a convergence of workflows. Modern computing is less about the operating system and more about services, containers, and platforms. Cloud development doesn't care whether your laptop runs Windows, Linux, or something else entirely. Containers abstract away the OS differences. Browsers have become operating systems of their own, hosting complex applications that behave the same everywhere. When your critical work happens inside a browser, a terminal, or a container, the host OS becomes less important than ever. Even file systems, once a major dividing line, are becoming shared territory. Windows can read Linux file systems more easily than before. Linux can mount Windows partitions without drama. Network storage, cloud sync, and cross-platform formats mean your data isn't locked to one environment. Your home directory follows you. Your configs live in Git repositories. Your workflow is portable. Dual booting, by contrast, feels rigid and old-fashioned. There's also a cultural shift happening. New users entering the tech world today don't grow up with the same OS loyalties. They grow up with smartphones, tablets, and web apps. To them, the idea of rebooting a computer just to run a different operating system sounds absurd. They expect instant context switching. They expect environments to coexist, and the industry is quietly adapting to that expectation. Windows embracing Linux wasn't just about developers. It was about staying relevant in a world where Linux already dominated servers, cloud infrastructure, and embedded systems. Interestingly, Linux has been merging with Windows in its own way too. Desktop environments have become more user-friendly, more polished, and more familiar. File managers, settings, panels, and app stores look less intimidating than they once did. Distros increasingly focus on sane defaults rather than endless configuration. This makes it easier for Windows users to cross over without feeling lost. The barrier to entry drops when people realize they can run their Windows apps anyway. The fear disappears entirely. Another piece of this puzzle is hardware. Modern PCs are powerful enough that running multiple operating systems simultaneously isn't a luxury. It's normal. A mid-range laptop today can handle a Linux VM, a Windows host, a browser with dozens of tabs, and a code editor without breaking a sweat. When resources are abundant, efficiency matters less than convenience. Why reboot when you can just keep everything running? Security also plays an interesting role. Linux environments inside Windows are often more isolated and controlled than a traditional dual boot setup. You can snapshot, roll back, destroy, and recreate environments in seconds. That changes how people experiment and learn. Instead of carefully partitioning disks and praying they don't break their bootloader, users can spin up Linux instances like disposable tools. That freedom encourages exploration, which further weakens the need for a permanent second OS installation. Of course, none of this means Windows and Linux are literally becoming the same thing. Their kernels are different. Their licensing models are different. Their communities are different. But from a user's perspective, those differences matter less each year. What matters is whether you can run your software, access your data, and get work done efficiently. And increasingly, the answer is yes, regardless of which side you start on. There's also a subtle shift in power dynamics. Linux hasn't won by replacing Windows on the desktop. Instead, it's infiltrated it. Linux runs the internet, Linux runs the cloud, Linux runs inside Windows itself. Microsoft didn't defeat Linux, it integrated it. And in doing so, it normalized Linux for millions of users who might never install Ubuntu or Arch on bare metal. That exposure matters. Once people get comfortable with the Linux command line, tools, and philosophy, the jump to a full Linux desktop no longer feels extreme. At the same time, Linux users are no longer forced to reject Windows entirely. They can acknowledge that some Windows software is genuinely good and still keep Linux as their primary environment. That flexibility reduces tribalism. It turns operating systems into tools rather than identities. And when that happens, the whole idea of dual booting starts to feel like a relic from a more divided era. So, are we really at the end of dual booting? Not completely. There will always be edge cases. Hardcore gamers who need absolute maximum compatibility. Professionals tied to very specific hardware or software. Purists who want total separation. Dual booting will survive, but more as a niche solution than a mainstream recommendation for most people. The question is no longer, should I dual boot, but which environment should I open right now? That's the real merger. Not a single operating system to rule them all, but a seamless blend of environments that coexist, cooperate, and overlap. Windows is no longer just Windows. Linux is no longer just Linux. They're layers in a larger computing experience. And once you see it that way, rebooting to switch sides feels unnecessary, even inconvenient. In a strange twist, this might be the most Linux-like outcome possible. Instead of conquering the desktop through force, Linux quietly became essential, invisible, and everywhere. It didn't replace Windows, it embedded itself within it. And Windows, rather than resisting, adapted. The result isn't a winner and a loser. It's a convergence that makes the old rules obsolete. Dual booting was a symbol of division, a workaround for incompatibility. The future is about coexistence, about running what you need, when you need it, without ceremony. And whether you start your day in Windows or Linux matters less than ever. Because in many ways, you're already using both at the same time.